April 1970. 3 men are 200,000 miles from Earth, slowly being poisoned by their own breath. In Houston, an engineer asks for a list of everything on board. He reads it, he stops, and he relaxes because of one item on it: a roll of grey tape. That was 1970. The tape was invented 27 years earlier by a grandmother who never made a dime. But the sticky part is much older. 1845. A doctor named Horace Day and a physician named William Shakut filed patent number 3965 with the United States government. The title was as boring as anything ever written. Improvement in adhesive plasters. What they had actually done was invent stickiness on demand. Here is the recipe. They took India rubber and boiled it down. They dissolved it in turpentine. Then they mixed in melted pine gum and litharge, which is a yellow oxide of lead, and a turpentine extract of cayenne pepper. Yes, cayenne pepper. They spread the resulting paste across strips of cotton cambric, and then they punched tiny holes through the whole thing so the skin underneath could breathe. It reads like a witch's brew. It was the most important chemical breakthrough of the century that nobody noticed, because here is what it did. Every adhesive before it needed something: heat, water, a solvent, time. This one needed nothing. You pressed it against a surface and it held. That is called a pressure-sensitive adhesive, and it was, functionally, magic. Nobody could tell you why it worked. Nobody would be able to tell you why for another 75 years. The reason rubber behaves the way rubber behaves comes down to long-chain molecules, and a German chemist named Hermann Staudinger did not prove those existed until the 1920s. They gave him a Nobel Prize for it. Day and Shikut had none of that. They boiled the stuff and watched what happened and wrote it down. They did not know the chemistry. They made it anyway. The other half of the story is a fabric. It is called duck, and the name has nothing to do with birds. It comes from the Dutch word duc, meaning cloth. Duck is a plain, brutally tight weave that has been around in English for 4 centuries. It was the material the working world was made of: sails, tents, wagon covers, mail sacks, fire hose jackets, work trousers. If you have ever owned a pair of Carhartts, you have worn duck. Rubber that sticks. Cloth that will not tear. For almost 100 years, nobody put them together. The pieces drifted toward each other slowly. In 1874, Robert Wood Johnson went into business with a man named George Seabury, making medicated plasters in New Jersey. In 1886, Johnson and his brothers founded Johnson & Johnson in New Brunswick. In 1921, a cotton buyer at the company named Earl Dixon got tired of his wife Josephine slicing her fingers open in the kitchen, so he stuck a square of gauze onto a strip of surgical tape and invented the Band-Aid. Then, in the early 1920s, an accountant somewhere noticed something odd in the sales figures. A druggist in Detroit was buying surgical tape by the crate. Not for hospitals. He was quietly reselling it to automobile factories, where painters used it to mask off two-tone paint jobs. Surgical tape was being used to build cars. Nobody had planned that. Nobody had asked for it. Johnson & Johnson chased it. In 1927, they spun up a division just for industrial tape and called it Revolite. In 1938, they renamed it the Industrial Tape Corporation and put it in a plant in Milltown, New Jersey. By 1943, that company had the rubber, the cloth, the machines, and 90 years of accumulated knowledge about making sticky things stay stuck under stress. What it did not have was a reason. That came in the mail. Weeks after Pearl Harbor, the War Department went looking for somewhere to build bombs where nobody could bomb them back. They wanted flat, inland, and forgotten. They found 6 farms outside a town called Amboy in Lee County, Illinois. They bought the farms. Then they built a city on top of them. The Green River Ordnance Plant was finished on December 15, 1942. 8,000 acres, 12 square miles of Illinois cornfield. 420 buildings, including its own hospital, its own fire department, its own dormitories, 12 power plants, a railroad classification yard, a weather station, a newspaper, and a radio station. Rows of earth-covered bunkers squatted across the fields so that an explosion in one would not take the rest with it. Some of the chemicals, according to the people who worked there, turned your hair green. Over 3 years, roughly 13,000 people passed through it, about 4,500 at a time. It made artillery shells, naval shells, bombs, fuses, detonators, rifle grenades, and rocket-propelled bazooka ammunition. Local historians say it may have been the only plant in America making that last one. And the men were leaving. By July 1944, women outnumbered men there almost 2-to-1. One of them was Vesta Oral Stout. She was born in Prophetstown, Illinois, on April 13, 1891, to a father named Ulysses Simpson Grant Wildman. She married Harry Stout in 1910. They had 8 children. In 1943, she was 51 years old, and 2 of her sons were in the Navy, one in the Pacific, one with the Atlantic Fleet. That is why she took the job. Not for the money, for them. Her station was inspection and packing, specifically the cartridges that launch rifle grenades. 11 cartridges to a box, the flaps sealed with thin paper tape, one small tab of that tape left loose and hanging. Then the whole box dipped in wax to make it waterproof and damp-proof. The design assumed one thing. A soldier grabs the tab, pulls, the wax cracks, the box opens. The tab tore off. Constantly. It is the same failure as the little tear strip on a box of crackers. Except the crackers are cartridges. The man opening the box is lying face down under machine gun fire, and the only tool he has to finish the job is his teeth. Vesta Stout solved it in about a minute of thinking. Use a strong cloth tape to close the seams. Make the tab out of the same cloth tape. She built one at her workstation. She tested it. It worked. She showed it to the government inspectors on the line, and they looked at it and agreed with her. It was better. Nothing changed. She had one option left. It cost 3 cents. On February 10th, 1943, Vesta Stout sat down and wrote a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Not her foreman, not a congressman, not the War Department. The President of the United States in the middle of the largest war in human history. She laid the problem out in plain handwriting and drew diagrams of it so he could see it. She wrote that the soldier would have to get that tape off somehow, maybe with his teeth, maybe with his knife if he was lucky enough to have one, and 9 chances out of 10 he did not. She told him she had 2 sons out there somewhere, one in the Pacific, one with the Atlantic Fleet. Then she reminded the President of the United States that he had sons in the service too. And she wrote one more line, which is the whole story in a sentence. She said she did not know who else to write to. A 51-year-old grandmother in a Lee County cornfield decided that the correct escalation path was the commander-in-chief. Nobody told her that was allowed. Nobody told her it wasn't. Roosevelt read it. He forwarded it to the War Production Board. 6 weeks later, on March the 26th, 1943, the Ordnance Department wrote back to her. Her change had been approved. The words in the letter were, "of exceptional merit." Then the board handed the job to the people with the rubber and the cloth. The Industrial Tape Corporation, Milltown, New Jersey. A team led by a Revelite man named Johnny Denoy, and a Johnson & Johnson engineer named Bill Gross. They took thin cotton duck. They coated the outside in polyethylene, a plastic barely 10 years old at the time, to make it waterproof. On the other side, they laid a rubber-based adhesive they called Polycoat. They dyed the whole thing Army Standard olive drab. And then they made one choice that nobody bothered to record as important. They designed it so it would tear cleanly by hand, not with scissors, not with a blade, with your fingers, in the dark, wearing gloves. That decision looked small at the time. It wasn't. Every single thing this product would ever become is downstream of that one choice. It is the tape you grab when there is no time and no tools, because it was engineered for a man who had neither. The tape shipped. And then it did the thing nobody planned. Soldiers started putting it on everything else. Jeep fenders, boots, tents, rifle stocks, canteens, broken windows, wounds. Johnson & Johnson's own 1945 annual report bragged that hundreds of thousands of miles of their waterproof tape had gone out on tanks, planes, and ammunition headed overseas. Hundreds of thousands of miles. The moon is about 240,000 miles away. They had made enough tape to get there. Hold on to that. The Americans called it 100-mile-an-hour tape because they used it to fix anything that moved. The British called it Black Nasty, or Harry Black. Officially, it had no name at all. It came home with the soldiers. And the first thing that happened when it got home was that somebody gave it the wrong name. Permanently. 1945. The war ends, and the tape goes into hardware stores. In 1950, a small industrial tape distributor in Cleveland, Ohio, called the Melvin A. Anderson Company, buys the rights to it. And then the post-war housing boom hands it a job nobody designed it for. Contractors discover it is fast and grabby and perfect for slapping over the seams of sheet metal ductwork. So Anderson changed the color, off the army green, onto silver gray to match galvanized steel. The name followed the color. By the middle of the 1950s, Americans were calling it duct tape. And here is the strange part. Almost everything you have been told about that name is disputed. The charming version says the soldiers called it duct tape because water ran off it like water off a duck's back, and because it was woven from cotton duck. Then civilians misheard duck as duct. The problem is the paper trail. Duct tape is genuinely old. The Oxford English Dictionary has it back in 1902, and an electrical trade magazine in 1894 was already telling readers to use a heavy duct tape, 1 inch wide, the kind printers used on their big presses. But that duct tape was not sticky. It was just a strip of cloth. When etymologists went looking for anyone calling the wartime adhesive duct tape during the war in writing, they came back with nothing. As far as the record shows, the tape had no specific name at all while it was saving lives, which leaves a possibility nobody enjoys. That duct came first. That duck was the mishearing, not the original, and that the lovely story about water and feathers was reverse-engineered afterward to explain a name that was already there. Historians still argue about it. Nobody has settled it. What is certain is that the word duck got trademarked in the early 1980s by a company that noticed customers kept saying duck when they meant duct, and concluded that correcting your customers is bad business. Then came the second insult. Nobody owned it. There is no patent for duct tape. Vesta Stout got a letter from the president and the Chicago Tribune's War Worker Award. She got no patent, no royalty, no equity, no percentage. And the term duct tape was never trademarked either. It went generic before anyone thought to register it. The most useful object of the 20th century became public property by accident, because nobody was paying attention. Then came the ridicule. As it spread, it became a punchline. The New York Times once called it national shorthand for a job done almost right. Duct tape stopped meaning competence and started meaning almost competence. In 1959, the professionals seceded. A cinematographer named Ross Lowell was shooting on the old Lindbergh estate in New Jersey and needed to mount lights without wrecking the house. He took the adhesive off a Permasil tape and put it on a cloth backing instead of plastic. Matte, no glare, peels off clean. That tape runs the film industry to this day. It is called gaffer tape. And it exists because professionals looked at duct tape and decided they needed something better. As for Vesta, she went back to Illinois and disappeared. She died on May 9th, 1966, at 75 years old, in a nursing home in Prophetstown, the town she was born in. 4 years later, her tape went to the moon. April 13th, 1970. 2 days out from Earth, an oxygen tank in the service module of Apollo 13 explodes. The command module is dying. Lovell, Swaggart, and Hayes crawl into the lunar module, a spidery little craft built to land on the moon, and start using it as a lifeboat. Then somebody runs the math. Aquarius was designed to keep 2 men alive for 2 days. It now has 3 men, and it needs 4. Oxygen was not the problem. Carbon dioxide was. Every breath those men took made the air more poisonous, and the machine pulling it back out was running out of capacity. Both halves of the spacecraft scrubbed carbon dioxide with canisters of lithium hydroxide. The command module had plenty of spares, and they were square. The lunar module sockets were round. The 2 vehicles had been built by different contractors, North American Aviation and Grumman. In 10 years of engineering, nobody had ever imagined a reason to swap parts between them. It is the same as buying a printer and discovering the cartridges only fit the other brand, except the printer is a lifeboat. Ed Smiley was chief of the Crew Systems Division, born on Christmas Day, 1929, on his grandfather's farm in Lincoln County, Mississippi. He had seen this coming the moment he heard they were moving into the lander. Here are the numbers he was watching. In a healthy spacecraft, the carbon dioxide reading sits around 2 or 3 millimeters of mercury. At 7, you change the canisters. At 15, the poisoning starts. Confusion. Impaired judgment. Blackout. It was climbing. Smiley asked Mission Control for a list, not of tools, of everything on board, because the only materials his team was allowed to use were materials already flying. He read the list. He saw duct tape on it. And he said, afterward, the single best sentence anyone has ever spoken about this product. I felt like we were home free. A Southern boy, he said, will never tell you that duct tape won't fix it. 2 days. Roughly 60 engineers and contractors, though Smiley always insisted the movie made it look like he did it alone. What they radioed up was a device built from 2 square canisters, plastic bags meant for storing garments, cardboard torn off the cover of the flight plan, a hose from a spacesuit, a sock, and a great deal of gray tape. The crew took about an hour to build it. They called it the mailbox. Within 30 minutes of switching it on, the carbon dioxide started falling. The day after splashdown, Richard Nixon gave the mission operations team the Presidential Medal of Freedom. 32 months later, Apollo 17, December 1972, the last one. Gene Cernan is loading the rover in the Taurus-Littrow Valley when a geology hammer sticking out of the shin pocket of his suit catches the right rear fender extension and rips it clean off. 17 inches of it. That sounds like nothing. It nearly ended the mission. The moon has no wind and no water, so its dust has never been worn smooth. Every grain is a fresh razor edge, ground down by micrometeorites over billions of years. The wire wheels fling it into what the astronauts called rooster tails, and in 1/6 gravity with no air to slow it down, it goes far. Dust on a white suit turns the suit into a heat absorber. Dust on a visor scratches the glass. Dust in a bearing is the end of the vehicle. And they had 2 more excursions ahead, 7 hours apiece. Cernan reached under his seat for the roll of tape, and it failed. He explained why at the debriefing. There was dust on everything. The first thing the tape touched was dust, and after that it would not stick to anything. The most reliable adhesive human beings had ever built was defeated by dirt. It held long enough to drive out. On the way back, it came off again and dropped into the powder. They did not stop. Overnight, Houston designed a new fender. In the morning, inside the lander, where the air was clean and the dust had settled on the floor, Cernan and Schmidt taped 4 stiff, laminated lunar maps together into a curved sheet and clamped it onto the rails using clamps stolen off the lamp of the optical alignment telescope. Taping it, Cernan said, "Just call me the little old fender maker." It held for the rest of the mission. Another 15 hours of driving on the surface of the moon. Now go back to 1945 and that annual report bragging about hundreds of thousands of miles of tape shipped overseas. They had made enough to reach the moon, and now it was there. If you're finding this story interesting, subscribe to the channel. Here at Common Law, we tell stories like this one every single week, and you are not going to want to miss what comes next. While the tape was going to the moon, it had been doing something back on Earth that was quieter and much larger. It had been renaming the country. In 1902, an engineer named Willis Carrier built a machine in a Brooklyn printing plant to control humidity. For 40 years, air conditioning belonged to movie theaters and department stores. Then the war ended. The factories pivoted to consumer goods, and the Federal Housing Administration started letting builders roll the cost of central air into a mortgage. And a house with central air is a house with ductwork. Miles of sheet metal snaking through the attic and the crawl space. Every joint of it needing a seal. That is the boom the tape got its name from. And that boom moved a nation. In 1950, 28% of Americans lived in the Sun Belt. By 2000, 40% did. The South had been hemorrhaging people for generations. By the 1960s, more were moving in than moving out. Texas alone grew by about 170% between 1950 and 2000. Historians like Raymond Arsenault put the turning point right at the arrival of household air conditioning. Today, nearly 90% of American homes have it. Air conditioning did not do that alone. Cold War money planted air bases and aerospace plants across the region, and federal civil rights law changed who was welcome to live there. But the climate stopped being a veto, and congressional seats follow people. So do electoral votes. The map of American political power got redrawn, in part by a machine that needed ducts. Now here is the joke. Duct tape does not work on ducks. In the summer of 1998, a physicist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory named Max Sherman, working with an engineer named Ian Walker, decided to actually test it. They built a wall of deliberately leaky duct joints and sealed them with 33 different products: clear tape, foil tape, mastic, aerosol sealant, and a lot of duct tapes. Then they cooked them, cycling hot and cold air through every 5 minutes for months, up to about 187 degrees. Almost everything passed. One category didn't. Sherman's assessment was that of everything they tested, only duct tape failed. And it failed reliably, and often catastrophically. The plastic backing shrinks faster than the adhesive. The rubber crystallizes and cracks. One sample peeled itself off a joint while it was just sitting on a workbench for a week before the test even started. The lab published a recommendation as an acronym: ABD. Anything but duct tape. Today, the state of California names it in the law. Title 24 says joints and seams shall not be sealed with cloth-back rubber adhesive duct tape, unless it is combined with mastic and drawbands. California effectively banned duct tape from the only job it is named after. And the country never fixed it. Energy Star estimates that in a typical American house, 20 to 30% of the air you pay to heat and cool leaks out of the ductwork before it reaches a single room. Roughly $1.04 of that utility bill goes straight into the attic. But by then, the tape had stopped being a product. It had become a reflex. And a man in Ohio was about to figure out what that was worth. It starts with an insurance salesman. In 1963, a young man out of Lakeview Terrace, a housing project on Cleveland's west side, sold an insurance policy to a man named Melvin Anderson. Anderson was so impressed by the pitch that he hired the kid as his very first employee. The kid's name was Jack Call, and he grew that little tape distributor's revenue tenfold. By 1971, he bought the whole company. $10,000 in cash and a $182,000 loan. Call it roughly $1.5 million in today's money, almost all of it borrowed. He renamed it Manco. Then he did what nobody in the industry had thought to do. For 30 years, duct tape had been sold like lumber. Anonymous sticky stacks, wound so tight you could barely pry a single roll loose from its neighbors. In 1980, Call gave it a brand name, and he spelled it the way his customers actually said it: duck. In 1984, he shrink-wrapped individual rolls and stuck a cartoon duck on the package. He beat 3M and Scotch and Mystic to it, out of a warehouse in Ohio. Within a few years, Manco was selling almost 40% of every roll of duct tape in America. In 1998, Carl sold to the German conglomerate Henkel for $116 million, better than $200 million in today's money, and handed roughly $27 million of it to his employees, who he had always insisted on calling partners. Then the culture caught it. From 1991 to 2006, a Canadian comedy show called The Red Green Show ran on American public television to about 1 million viewers a week, built almost entirely on one running joke: duct tape is the handyman's secret weapon. And then, on February 10, 2003, Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge and the U.S. Fire Administrator David Paulison stood in front of the country and told Americans to stock duct tape and plastic sheeting to seal a room against a chemical or biological attack. The shelves emptied. The Pressure Sensitive Tape Council issued a press release announcing that its 26 member companies had mobilized to meet demand. The Senate Minority Leader stood up and said Americans deserved better than being told to go buy tape. February 10th, 2003. Vesta Stout licked her stamp on February 10th, 1943, 60 years to the day. Today, analysts put the global duct tape market at roughly $5 billion a year. And this is the part that gets people. It never left orbit. NASA calls it gray tape, and it is on the International Space Station manifest right now. More than 20 different adhesives fly up there, and duct tape and Captain are the two the crews reach for most. Until 2021, there was no dispenser for it, so astronauts tore it with their teeth in space, exactly the way Vesta Stout soldiers had. A group of American high school students designed a one-handed dispenser, and NASA flew it. And the Smithsonian keeps a plain roll of duct tape in its permanent collection, catalogued as an artifact, because it came home on the final mission to repair the Hubble Space Telescope. It also went into medicine. In 2002, at Madigan Army Medical Center outside Tacoma, doctors ran a randomized trial on 51 patients aged 3 to 22. Half got liquid nitrogen on their warts. Half got a square of duct tape, left on 6 days at a stretch. The tape cleared 85%. The liquid nitrogen cleared 60%. It ran in the archives of pediatrics. Then, in 2007, a team at a veterans hospital repeated it on 80 adults against a proper placebo. 21% for the tape, 22% for the placebo. Dead even with nothing. Doctors have been arguing about it ever since. In NASCAR, they use it as a tuning instrument. Crews tape off sections of the grille to force air over the hood and add downforce at 200 miles an hour. Too much and the engine cooks. They call it 200-mile-an-hour tape. And on November 20th, 2024, at Sotheby's in New York, a banana bought that same morning for 35 cents from a fruit stand on the Upper East Side, stuck to a wall with one strip of silver duct tape, sold for $6,240,000. 7 bidders, 6 minutes. The winner technically purchased a certificate granting him permission to tape a banana to a wall and call it art. Then he ate the banana. A grandmother in Illinois never made a cent from this tape. A crypto billionaire paid $6 million for one strip of it. Which brings us back to a spacecraft. Houston, April 1970. The engineer reading the list of everything on board. His name was Ed Smiley. He died on April 21st, 2025, at 95 years old in Tennessee. Almost 55 years to the day after he kept 3 men breathing with a sock, a hose, some cardboard, and a roll of tape. It was built to open a box. It opened a war. It got renamed for a job it cannot do. It got mocked as the mark of a bad repair. It was never patented, and nobody ever owned it. And it brought 3 men home from the moon. There is almost certainly a roll of it within 30 feet of you right now. Kitchen drawer, glove box, bottom shelf of the garage. It cost about $6, and you have never once thought about it. And there is one more piece of it that is not in a drawer. December 1972. Driving back to the lander, the fender extension that Gene Cernan taped on with his own gloved hands worked loose and fell into the dust of Taurus Littrow. They did not turn around. NASA's own record says so. It is still lying there. The map fender came home and sits in a case at the Smithsonian in Washington. That one did not. No human being has stood on the surface of the moon since. Vesta Stout died 4 years before Apollo 13 and 6 years before that fender came off. She never knew any of it. She wrote one letter in February of 1943 because nobody at her job would listen to her, and because she thought a soldier should not have to open a box with his teeth. That was the entire ambition. Most people who change the world get a statue. Vesta Stout got a letter from the president and a grave in Prophetstown, Illinois. Her monument is 240,000 miles up, lying in gray dust, holding nothing together at all. The fix went to war, and part of it never came home. If this story surprised you, subscribe to Common Lore and tell me in the comments which part of the duct tape story got you the most. And leave a like so more people can find this video.